Hello, welcome back to the channel. I'm Zach Markowski, and today I have another round of literary analysis, or really just a few excerpts that I want to discuss in relation to each other, both in their historicity as well as their relevance to the present day moment. Because a lot of thinking and philosophy and our body of knowledge is caught up in the past in the sense that it's tied down and bogged down in a post-eschatology world, meaning in in a post-history world where history happened and is done with, and everything that exists in the world is a model of what already happened in the past that's going to then determine our present, and the future of the future is the present. So where it's all going, you know, thinker and philosopher and writer Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche began to not just parse out where we came from, but also where we might be going. He predicted 2 centuries of nihilism. He kind of discussed how all of humanity's genius and body of works was created by constraint and struggle and fight for power, and how that force is the very thing that creates genius. So, in the wake of history, when all these various ideologies, ideas, philosophies, and historical characters exist in the human mind only, in a nihilistic world, as Nietzsche predicted, where people don't even believe in man. It's like, never mind not believing in God, we don't even believe in the thing that's supposed to model after him, which is the human being, right? So he foresaw all these problems, and while everyone gets caught up in the idea that God is dead, he framed it in many ways, including in his book, The Gay Science here, which I'm going to read aphorism 108, which is called New Struggles. And he writes, after Buddha was dead, his shadow was still shown for centuries in a cave, a tremendous, gruesome shadow. God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown, and we still have yet to vanquish his shadow too. And we still have to vanquish his shadow too. So obviously in Western context, he's talking about the Buddha, but there's no talking about philosophical caves without going back to the origin of our highest art, which I'm not going to say is Platonism or mathematics, but the very belief in idealism itself, the very idea of some extra dimensional realm where forms exist in their perfect, basically it's the outline for heaven, right? You can see where Christianity kind of takes some of its shaping here, because the Christian cult was a whole cluster mess of various ideologies and weirdos whose history is very questionable, and then was consolidated down over time as a gross mistake and overstatement of language and egocentrism and logocentrism, I'd say. But what Nietzsche's framing here is that you see that people will like there's this old Buddhist notion, or another way it's been said is, you can point to something, but the dog's going to stare at your finger. So similarly, he's saying that for centuries and probably millennia to come, if humanity survives in any large or small measure, there's going to be projections and memories and shadows of the past that are worshipped, that are followed, that are believed in. And then this might sound innocuous until you consider, oh, this whole notion of chasing shadows has always been at the expense of the future. Yet the very chasing of these shadows of what's real, what can we bring from the unreal into the real world, whether that's art or science, right? This very thing shows us that there's truth in this. So the belief in Platonism, the belief in an ideal world and an ideal realm, right? It's been so strong that arguably the need for fantasy became the biggest addiction, the biggest illusion, that one's labor works in purpose to some greater form, right? And really, going back to the origin, the real power is invisible, so no one ever knows what they're worshiping anyway. This goes hand in hand with my type theory that states that society is a bunch of different personality types who never really meet or know each other, who kind of all exist in their own like if you can think of the Olympic rings, how those rings all exist connecting only in certain spots, and then the rest of the rings don't seem to touch, and there's wide spaces in between everything else, or in some areas closer maybe. But it's that kind of image, or it's that kind of symbol, which I think does show you the human, kind of how human structure plays out. Or in terms of biblical narrative, we can look at like the Tower of Babel and this idea that we're going to constrain the world to one language, one God, one thing was always it was always a comedy of errors. It was always a tragedy that wanted to write itself into a comedy, right? That it serves a purpose, that it will live forever, that the individual will live forever. Arguably, you could say thinking itself is where what's most desirable in men and where lots of undesirable men hide themselves, right? It's in thinking. It's rationalization of justification of whatever their existence is for anyone to examine. Do you find this adequate for sentient life, or does it appear a gross abomination for you? Maybe the biggest art of the last century was, kind of that Hieronymus Bosch, that kind of horror and that kind of terror finding its home in literature and media, in art, all the way to the postmodern world that dissected itself down to nothing, and is basically the erosion of will and the disassembly of the human being as manifest in an art movement. You know, I'm getting off into the weeds here, but I'm trying to paint a larger flow of human thought and human struggle through the centuries, right? The idealism that there's a fight worth fighting, that there are struggles worth having, that there is something to do regardless of anyone's time, place, or position therein, and then that these desires are the things that fuel the machine itself, and that within this machine there are countless caves and shadows which captures people's surplus cognition. Think of like, okay, I live in America. In a country like America, since this place started, it's been filled with religious cults and religious nut jobs. It basically became our biggest attraction. Hey, come here. You can be a weirdo. You might be able to live and survive here. But again, the nature of business has been to constrain everything towards the state, which kind of brings me to our next ideas here, which is more Nietzsche following this track of history, coming out of uh, the Renaissance age where, Italy basically revivified classicism and brought about new movements in art, thinking, and technology, to where the church had formerly constrained everything, to how the whole Middle Age was then broken up into an increasingly fractured world, which Nietzsche is going to describe here, which is the birth of the modern nation state. So he says, now, how does the philosopher view the culture of our time? Very differently, to be sure, from how it is viewed by those who professors of philosophy who are so well contented with their new state. When he thinks of the haste and hurry now universal, or the increasing velocity of life, of the cessation of all contemplativeness and simplicity, he almost thinks that what he is seeing are the symptoms of a total extermination and uprooting of culture. The waters of religion are ebbing away and leaving behind swamps or stagnant pools. The nations are again drawing away from one another in the most hostile fashion and long to tear one another to pieces, and they do. The sciences, pursued without any restraint and in the spirit of the blindest laissez-faire, are shattering and dissolving all firmly held belief. I'd say, and now in our post-psychedelic, retribalized media world, I'd say that it's not just that the belief has been dissolved, but all culture has been reduced to, like, as Terence McKenna would say, has been reduced to that of the airport mall, right? Like overpriced consumer goods that you're probably going to resent or regret buying, mass-produced culture, whatever is most popular. So now it's not just the dissolution of previous culture, it's the establishment of a bland monoculture that's meant, again, very, what I've said of American, Western, and thus global culture and commercialism is it's naive, it's childish, it's anti-intellectual. Everything about it is the reducing valve on human consciousness and the development of any kind of further body sensitivity or intellectual understanding there, and because everything is constrained to a few sole ends. Like I said, that's the creation of genius. But now that that's clear, then what once you're aware of the constraint, you're left to question what's the purpose of it, and do you need to follow that or use that? So that's what he's kind of going to go on with here. The world has never been more worldly, never poorer in love and goodness. The educated classes are no longer lighthouses or refugees in the midst of this turmoil of secularization. They themselves grow daily more restless, thoughtless, and loveless. Everything contemporary, art and sciences included, serves the coming barbarism. The cultured man has degenerated into the greatest enemy of culture, for he wants to lyingly deny the existence of the universal sickness and thus obstructs the physicians. They become incensed, these poor wretches, whenever one speaks of their weakness and resist their pernicious lying spirit. They would dearly like us to believe that of all the centuries, theirs has borne away the prize, is the last man. And they shake with artificial merriment, right? This was the beginning of them. Their way of hypocritically simulating happiness sometimes has something touching about it, because their happiness is something so completely incomprehensible. One does not even feel like asking what Tannhauser asked Bitterwolf, what then, poor man, have you even enjoyed? In Wagner's Tannhauser Act 2. For we ourselves know better and know otherwise. A winter day lies upon us, right? So he didn't say, hey, it's going to be rough, but then this next century is going to get over it. He predicted the worst of what was to come in all of human history as far as modern people are concerned, in terms of destruction and rampage and orgiastic, consumeristic feeding frenzies and the destruction of life and culture and thought and elegance and taste, all these various things. And he saw in two centuries of nihilism, that leaves the question of what if the worst is yet to come? And I think, I'd read more, but I kind of already have from these sections. But I have these excerpts from Jung's The Undiscovered Self, where he discusses mankind, the mass man or mass-produced culture man or the last man, where he discusses this very road to state slavery. He's describing this post-fascist world outbreak of, whether it was, whatever the ideology is, it was the modified monotheism of the past, right? That tendency towards central state organization, nothing exists outside of this one mode of being that serves one purpose, one people, one, right? This obsession with monotheism, this obsession with idealism by total repression. So this development becomes logically unavoidable the moment the individual masses together with others and becomes obsolete, right? So Jung is talking about how the moment the individual becomes part of the masses, he disappears therein. Apart from agglomerations, right, huge masses of people in which the individual disappears anyway, one of the chief factors responsible for psychological mass-mindedness is scientific rationalism, which robs the individual of his foundations and his dignity. This is a lot of what Terence McKenna talked about. As a social unit, he has lost his individuality and become a mere abstract number in the Bureau of Statistics. He can only play the role of it, right? Reality is statistical, like Huxley wrote. Looked at rationally and from outside, or no, that was George Orwell. That is exactly what he is, and from this point of view, it seems positively absurd to go on talking about the value or meaning of the individual. Indeed, one can hardly imagine how one ever came to endow individual human life with so much dignity when the truth to the contrary is as plain as the palm of your hand. That is to say, in a world of uniform pieces, objects, subjects, the meat market of human beings, where every cog in the machine is replaceable by not just any other cog, but likely another machine or an artificial intelligence, the human being has become the obsolete piece of the machine. Right? Everyone's built the God in the machine. So he can only play the role of an interchangeable unit of infinitesimal importance. right? Of increasingly less importance, right? You don't even matter. And if you're remembered, it's likely for the act you put on and not who you really are, because that's part of tendency towards oneness, is the donning of many masks, the creation of many masks, which is to say art. Looked at rationally and from the outside, that is exactly what he is, right? An interchangeable unit. And from this point of view, it seems positively absurd to go on talking about the value and meaning of the individual. Seen from this standpoint, the individual really is of diminishing importance, and anyone who wished to dispute this would soon find himself at a loss for arguments. The fact that the individual feels himself or the members of his family or the esteemed friends in his circle to be importantly merely and underlies a slight cosmic subjectivity of his feeling. Right? So what? The world is made of countless individuals and groups. That doesn't mean anyone's special. For what are the few compared with 10,000 or 100,000, let alone a million? Right? This is Stalin. The joke or the death of one is a tragedy, the death of a million is a statistic. For what are few compared with the 10,000 or the million? This recalls the argument of a thoughtful friend with whom I once got caught up in a huge crowd of people. Suddenly he exclaimed, "Here you have the most convincing reason for not believing in immortality. All these people want to be immortal. Here in America, yeah, everyone wants to be the big winner. Everyone wants to be the big shot. Everyone's going to be the big man. Ooh, yeah, ooh." It's really absurd, right? The egomania behind it is just world-destroyingly absurd. So the bigger the crowd, the more negligible the individual becomes. But if the individual, overwhelmed by the sense of his own puniness and impotence, should feel that his life has lost its meaning, which, after all, is not identical with public welfare and higher standards of living, then he is already on the road to state slavery, and without knowing or wanting it, has become its proselyte, right? He's become a zealot. He's become its proponent, right? Whether it's Coke or Pepsi, left or right, up or down, he's got his message, he's got his ideology, he's already there. So when he has no resource which to combat the evidence of his senses and reason, that is just what is happening today. We are all fascinated and overawed by statistical truths and large numbers, and are daily apprised of the nullity and futility of the individual personality, since it is not represented and personified by any mass organization, right? Those exist to subsume, consume, make a product of the individual. The individual becomes a caricature or a actor or a bit part. In America, I've talked about this before. This is the land of scripts. We turn human beings into scripted creatures, whether it's the corporation, whether it's the state, whether it's art and media, even YouTube. People follow their scripts. People react to the scripts, right? Like the whole thing, right? At which point it's almost impossible to get away from any of the scripts, because everything, like all roads lead to Rome, basically. It's hard to ever get away from it. And then if you try, people will drag you back into the muck and the mire. So conversely, those personages who strut about on the world stage and whose voices are heard far and wide seem, to the uncritical public, to be borne along on some mass movement or on the tide of public opinion, and for this reason are either applauded or execrated. They're praised and blamed, judged anyway, right? Since mass suggestion plays the predominant role here, right? Mass conditioning, mass influence, propaganda, it remains a moot point whether the messages is their own, for which they are personally responsible, or whether they merely function as a megaphone for collective opinion. By their very position is an admission. It's like, hey, what's it matter if your message is personal or not? You're speaking for a herd, you're representing a herd, right? Everything, like reality, breaks down at those statistics. So it goes on. Under these circumstances, it is small wonder that individual judgment grows increasingly uncertain of itself, and what responsibility is collectivized as much as possible, i.e., shuffled off by the individual and delegated to a corporate body. In this way, the individual becomes more and more a function of society, right? It's Kafka-esque, it's Orwell-esque, it's Huxley-esque, is three thinkers who got ahead of the world and saw where it was going. The complete depersonification of man, the complete dominance of man, the complete domestication of man, the complete creation of a homo not economicus, because you can't even afford to be that anymore. It's like a homo consumericus. And I know people like to say these stories like, oh, look, GDP and economics and reality is statistical, and these human beings are trying to get jobs to do these things and create a higher GDP. It's like, no, I think what we have is a sort of economical famine, an economical culling, right? And you can see it in the fact that a lot of people who want to have kids don't want to have kids because of the state of the world. A lot of people who want kids can't afford kids. A lot of people decide against it one way or another, so on and so forth. A lot of smart people, they don't have enough kids anyway. A lot of other people who aren't that smart make the most kids. You know, it kind of goes on like that. So you begin to see a serious problem appearing before the world's eyes, right? What happens when this thing gets out of control? Well, the whole function becomes the management, becomes the corralling, becomes the herding, right? And it's done under the guise of culture and civility, but as Orwell writes about politics, everything about politics is about state slavery. It's about hiding your barbarism. I think who I'm going to discuss next is G.I. Gurdjieff, and what he says is everything about modern civilization is slavery and fine words. That's what like at best you have sincere actors and shallow actors who are a bit more delightful and enjoyable to be around, especially in their childlike nature. And then everyone else is, again, they're moved by and moved to these larger mass forces. And from here, in the future episodes, I'm going to get into Nietzsche's The Greek State here, which basically extrapolates everything there is to say about Plato and Platonism in a which is a facing off with the pessimistic and nihilistic reality at the end of culture's rope, which is culture's art, which the rest of the world came to see as literal. Or in another way, you could say, as McKenna talked about, like in shamanic cultures, the creator and holder of values understands that they're made up. Yes, relative to human affect, they mean something to us by way of the fact that we're born into a culture and a family, and no one is actually responsible for what was set in motion a long time ago, but we all play our part. So the ones who make the art know the human faculties that create it. Those who don't wind up taking it seriously, and they get mad, and they get egomaniacally mad to the point of destruction. And arguably on its widest idealistic, most art-producing scale, it can't help but destroy itself, which kind of seems where our production goes. But to kind of round us out, because I'm not just talking about, again, everyone's stuck in the mud. Everyone wants to stare at the mud and just talk about the mud, but I'm talking about human beings. I'm talking about the development of human consciousness here, the growth of human consciousness that isn't weighed down. Like, this is very Emersonian, right? That history means nothing to me, if not a cheerful apologue to my being and becoming. What's that mean? It means, hey, the rest of you can be weighed down by your own conception, which is your own bad conscience of the world. But to me, unless this is a celebration of having lived and a will to create therein, then we don't have to drag the rest of the dead weight forward. You can leave it where it is. You know, where does the hole stop? Arguably where one stops digging. Now, I understand that to break through beyond the mundane realms of thought and consciousness takes arguably a lifetime of development. What I'm arguing is we've never even taken seriously the real development of human consciousness in all its faculties, from the fact that the voice itself is sonar in the medium of air, to how the brain processes it, the speed of emotion and sensory data and intuition versus the speed of thought, which is the most recent, which is arguably the slowest and mired down by the larger production. You know, again, what I'm saying is the intelligent and the genius have always been waylaid by also the average and the stupid, right? It's been a game of survival, and intelligence is that game, right? So getting back to what Gurdjieff was saying, is in this game of survival, what you can see is the same old neurotic animal panic play out. There's this, again, it's a lot of finery for slavery. And that's what Nietzsche talks about for the Greek state, that it's not the art needing man that determines what the terms and the taste are of the modern day. It's the person who needs illusion. It's the person struggling who needs to be catered and pandered to. And I'm not speaking badly of sympathy here. I'm saying we are a all too indulgent, pitiful culture that does nothing but destroy people in pitying them. And it's all a cover again for the bad conscience of a history that is stacked up that is apparent for everybody to see. Whether anyone wants to deny it or go back to arguing Coke or Pepsi for or against it. So what Gurdjieff is saying here, though, is that forget all that. Forget the masses. Forget the individuals who hide in the masses. Forget everyone who's anonymous therein. We're talking about men. We're talking about human beings. We're talking about individual animals who have the appearance of being something more than what they really are. So Gurdjieff says it's his being. People think that a man's knowledge does not depend on his being, right? As if knowledge is just some other data set that is irrelevant to his being, appended on. People of Western culture put great value on one level of a man's knowledge, but they do not value the level of a man's being and are not ashamed of the low level of their own being. What have I said over and over? A crass, crude, anti-intellectual, naive, idealistic, whimsical, delusional culture where I think the end result is going to be more and more mental illness and more problems of the management of masses of these egomaniacal people that the country and culture has created. But Gurdjieff goes on, they do not even understand what it means. They do not understand that a man's knowledge depends on his level of being. In questions of being, time, experience, sensing, the way one's mapped the world, knowledge and becoming, the way one can translate this, not just project their own thoughts and feelings, but actually pick up where other people are coming from, right? Part of being an intelligent animal is being a social animal. If you can't actually communicate yourself or carry yourself in a way that other people want to relate to or that means something to them, who or what is wrong here, right? Or if your very being is so rapacious that you inspire resentment in the world around you, is that really the world's fault? See, the thing about resentment and contempt is it's at least honest. So all those people out in the world raving and ranting about their endless resentment, what Nietzsche would call the will's greatest struggle, it's his antipathy to time. And that meaning that it can't change time, that it can't go backwards and fix things or make things better for itself, that it can only go forward, and that its very existence is an admission of its own power of where it's at. This is what Gurdjieff is talking about. So in a world of mass-produced culture, mass-produced minds, a system of dependence, a system of interchangeable cogs, that is a very low level of being to inhabit. It is a way of life and is a daily conversation. It's a whole lot of nothing. It's a nihilistic morass, which is why the culture and the people and everything is why the way it is. The delusions, the insanity, the unhappiness, the addiction to both ideas and fantasy and art, as well as the addiction to stuff like piles of acorns and clothes and consumerism, right? It is very much a diseased way of life, given the way everyone was domesticated in a increasingly toxified environment. And I mean a toxified mental environment as well as a physical environment. And I know this, and I'm not speaking generally or even like a hippie. I'm speaking as someone who worked in environmental assessment and consulting a long time and knows how thoroughly polluted this place is and was for all of history. And then it was only not even in the last century that anyone began to say, does this affect the world? Are we affecting ourselves and one another? Right? Do you see the problem here? Do you see how thought didn't even come into existence until the last 100 years, right? That for thousands of years, people thought they knew how to think, or they thought that their projections were also their social reality, when in reality, people have been devising their own values and their own works of art and their own linguistic substructures and mappings of reality that exist alongside or contrary to whatever a culture's popular or main narrative is. Back to that, in modern terms, the Overton window. In older context, just basically what's the range of acceptable thought and feeling before they call the cops, throw you in the madhouse, fight with you, argue with you, make your life miserable, put you on a chain, like Gurdjieff kind of talks about. The whole monetary system in America tends towards a family mafia style, right? It's all Italian bookkeeping at the end of the day, and everyone's led by Alicia Money. So again, this is why the shy deer hide. This is why the intellectuals shut up. This is why everyone hides and follows along and tries to imitate other people to be popular. Even thinking about going to school in this country, I remember growing up here, and the teacher would ask a simple question. Out of a class of 30, 2 or 3 people would raise their hands, probably less than ever. And then you see with smart people, it's like they don't care if they're wrong. They're just wanting an education. You see, most people never wanted an education. Most people never wanted to be that social, because the larger thing is people are in it for themselves. And that's what mass-minded egoism is bound by the illusion of the state, which in reality can't even manage the very problems it's created in the world. So everyone's chasing the ball, and that ball's already run away. Anyway, I wanted to read this larger excerpt, which is from Ouspensky. He was a Russian psychologist. His book In Search for the Miraculous, which is largely about G.I. Gurdjieff and his kind of belief and thought system that did concern itself with man's psychic capacity, his real time, real life being, his own memory of himself as understood and developed over time in the creation of works in art and the manifestation of his being in this world. Not a theoretical being, not something he hides from or a persona or a mask he hides from, but the actual development of his character, his very body. In terms of old wisdom, its whole concepts to say, hey, men concern themselves with not just being themselves, meaning they're not trying to copy other men, other cultures, other people and things outside themselves, but they do concern themselves with truth, beauty, and strength, right? Why does anyone see any place in the world where people select for the opposites outside of art? No. It's acceptable in art, and everywhere else it's beaten, it's shied away from, it's deselected for. Arguably, last man, is what it looks like when societies of mass cultures and individuals have been deselected for by the ongoing pressurized forces of so many constrained, mutually hostile forces in the state that Nietzsche describes, which, as we know from Thucydides and the Greek state, inevitably ends in civil war and tyranny. Basically the breakdown of oligarchy, privatism and piratism, right? We go back to our tribal roots. We go back to where we came from. And the fact that we have a civilized veneer, right? This gets into postmodernism, cyberpunk, techno-feudalism, which people were talking about decades ago, never mind that the word gained popularity in recent times. But this is all just a mapping of kind of where we've been as a people and a culture and where we're going. So I'm going to pick up next time with more of Gurdjieff, one or the other, or Nietzsche's The Greek State. If you want to check those works out, you can find them all over the place, free online. As Gurdjieff discusses, when it comes to the knowledge economy, 80-20, like everything else, nothing is hidden. Those who don't want to know, don't want to know. It's kind of like Orwell says, that those who don't want to know stay sane by not knowing, so that's why they don't concern themselves with knowledge. Gurdjieff's premise is that the whole part of the rise and fall of civilizations is the collection and generation of knowledge. So it's not actually a process of civilizing that is this building of a body. Like I said, it's more like through all of history, the story of history was the history of a body of knowledge that was suppressed by the masses and the oligarchies. And now we find ourselves in the modern day, which is the wreckage of that history. I have a lot more exploration to do of both the wreckage and what comes next. Again, I'm Zach Markowski. Thanks for checking out the channel, and I'll see you next time.